I will give you rest from all your enemies. Moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men and with the stripes of the sons of men, but my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul when I put away from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. Did you get that? God says not once but repeatedly, David, your throne will be established forever. Your son, your descendant, will reign on this throne, and he shall reign forever. God made a covenant with David. David didn't make a covenant with God. God made a covenant with David. And God said, your descendant will reign on the throne. Now, you can imagine, as people looked back in the days of Jesus and said, is it possible that we will have one who will be our own to sit on the throne? What we have now is a half-breed. He's not Jewish. He's not even one who worships the living God. And he is our king, this Herod. Will we ever see this fulfillment? And God had given a promise. Near the end of his days, David testified concerning what God had said. You can find this quote in 2 Samuel, the 23rd chapter and the 5th verse, where David testifies, God has made with me an everlasting covenant. God made a covenant, and it will not be denied. Ezra the Ethionite wrote one of the Psalms. Now, I know that you don't read a lot of Ezra the Ethionite, but Ezra the Ethionite wrote a psalm, and you need to listen to this psalm as he looks back and under the inspiration of the Spirit of God sees what God was doing. Now I'm going to read the 89th Psalm and just a few verses. I'm going to read the 20th, the 21st, and then the 24th or the 34th through the 37th verse. Listen to what this psalm has to say. God speaking through this psalmist, he says, I have found David my servant. And with my holy oil I have anointed him, so that my hand shall be established with him. My arm also shall strengthen him. And then I slip down to that 34th verse. I will not violate my covenant or alter the word that went forth from my lips. Once for all I have sworn by my holiness, I will not lie to David. His offspring shall endure forever, his throne as long as the sun before me. Like the moon it shall be established forever, a faithful witness in the skies. Selah. When you see that term Selah, it means stop and think about this. Pause here and consider what I just said. God says, I made a king, and that king's descendant will reign on this throne forever. There were multiple kings that sat on David's throne, but we know that God cursed one named Coniah. We saw in a previous message that God said this one will not have any descendants sitting on David's throne, and now we were in a conundrum. And when we compared in a previous message the genealogies that were given by Dr. Luke and that were given by Matthew, we see how God resolved the conundrum. Because David's descendant that comes through Coniah cannot sit on the throne, but one who comes through another son named Nathan may sit on the throne. Mary was a descendant of Nathan. Joseph was the legal descendant of Coniah. Joseph had the legal right to the throne, and Mary had the theological right to the throne. And when they came together as husband and wife, they had, whoever their child would be, both the theological and the legal right to occupy the throne of David. That child, the firstborn, and no other child may be seated on the throne of David, and that child is the one who is presented as the king of Israel. God's anointed one, God's promised son, is the only one that would ever be permitted to sit on the throne of David. To the Jewish mind, and especially to the people living in that day, that time, they would look to this and say, we have such longing for the time that we will see David's descendant seated on the throne. There's a psalm that was written to speak of that one, that anointed one that would be seated on the throne. I want you to go back again to the Psalms, and I want you to go to the second psalm, and I want you to scope in on what should be a fairly familiar psalm to you. Listen to what God has to say in Psalm the second. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs, and the Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. The king would present himself to the nations, fulfilling yet another ancient prophecy that is cited in Matthew. In the 21st chapter of Matthew, when Jesus presented himself to Jerusalem, Matthew looks back and he recalls a promise that God had made concerning his king. Say to the daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, and on a colt the foal of a beast of burden. Jesus presented himself as the king of Israel, and the people rejected him. Even as the little children rejoiced in his coming on what we celebrate as Palm Sunday. And as they cast their cloaks before him, and as they cast down palm fronds, there were some who were religious leaders who complained. What's all this noise about? What are all these children shouting about? Make them be quiet. And Jesus had to rebuke them. And after he had come to the city and been rejected by the leaders who would sway the whole populace to reject him, we read these words in Luke's gospel, the 19th chapter and the 42nd verse. If you knew this day what would bring peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. Jesus looked over the city and he wept. I presented myself as king. You rejected God's anointed one. And if you had only known what would bring peace, but now it's too late. When the Magi came into the presence of Jesus and his mother Mary, they came into the presence of the King of Israel. He had been identified as such, and they anticipated he was a king. He had been announced as such by the heavens themselves. But they also came into the presence of the shepherd of Israel. You go back in your minds and you go back in your scriptures and you remember that when they first presented themselves to Herod and asked the question, where is the one that is born king of the Jews? They cited Micah of Moresheth. You recall that prophecy, we read it just a bit ago, that he would be born in Bethlehem. But he that would be born would be the shepherd of Israel. Now, the kings of Israel were frequently compared with shepherds. As a matter of fact, that's a very common theme that runs throughout the whole of the Old Testament. For instance, Asaph penned a psalm that speaks of the fact that the king is to be a shepherd. There in the 78th psalm, I read these words, God chose David his servant and took him from the sheepfolds. From following the nursing ewes, he brought him to shepherd Jacob, his people. Israel, his inheritance. With upright heart, he shepherded them and guided them with skillful hand. Now, this is an incredibly important point. Don't rush past it. Because it would be very easy to rush past the point and say, well, of course, David was a shepherd, and he became a king. But the point that is being conveyed to those in Israel is that the king was to be God's shepherd. The people didn't belong to the king. The people belonged to God, and the king was responsible to shepherd them, to tend them. As a matter of fact, you read in the Word of God that the people of Israel were viewed as God's flock, and the kings were simply the shepherds, the caretakers that would provide for God's flocks. The situation isn't very different from that of a pastor, which is simply another fine term for shepherd, a poime. One who realizes these are not my people, these are God's people, and my responsibility is to provide for God's people, not what they want, but what they need. Rest, shelter, protection, food, refreshment. As a matter of fact, you see that theme running throughout the Old Testament as God repeatedly speaks of his shepherds, his kings. Let's just look at some of these instances when the people of Israel first approached David and they were going to ask him to become their king. In the book of 2 Samuel, that 5th chapter, that 2nd verse, I read these words, that as they approach him in times past when Saul was king over us, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. And the Lord said to you, you shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel. David, you are to be the shepherd of Israel. We understand that's God's designation of you. That is your responsibility. As a matter of fact, when you read a little further, you realize that that was precisely how God viewed David. But not only had God viewed David in that manner, but when you read before that, the judges had been called shepherds of Israel. So from the very first establishment of the nation, God is saying those who are leaders are to be shepherds. Is it any surprise then when David's son, Messiah, will come on the scene? He is to be the shepherd of Israel. Now, according to what we saw in 2 Samuel, that 7th chapter and that 8th verse, that David was taken from the pasture, from following the sheep, that he should be a prince over God's people Israel and shepherd them. Now, Ezekiel, the prophet, looks forward to God's reign. And I want you to focus in on how he looks forward to the Anointed One's reign. This is that millennial reign of Jesus, the Son of God. And notice how he looks at this reign. It's found in the book of Ezekiel. It's found in that 37th chapter. And I begin to read in that 21st verse, and I want you to listen carefully. I will take the people of Israel from the nations around them, among which they have gone, and will gather them all around and bring them to their own land. And I will make them one nation in the land on the mountains of Israel, and one king shall be king over them all, and they shall no longer be two nations, no longer divided into two kingdoms, and they shall not defile themselves any more with their idols and their detestable things, or with any of their transgressions. But I will save them from all the backslidings in which they have sinned, and will cleanse them. And they shall be my people, and I will be their God. My servant David shall be a king over them, and they shall all have one shepherd. They shall walk in my rules and be careful to obey my statutes. They shall dwell in the land that I gave to my servant Jacob, where your fathers lived. They and their children's children shall dwell there forever. And David my servant shall be their prince forever. I will make a covenant of peace with them. It shall be an everlasting covenant with them, and I will set them in their land and multiply them, and they will set my sanctuary in their midst forever. My dwelling place shall be with them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people, and then the nations will know that I am the Lord who sanctifies Israel when my sanctuary is in their midst forever. David's son would be the king, and he would also be the shepherd over Israel. Now, you can't think of God's Messiah as a shepherd without thinking of the shepherd's psalm. You really can't. And I have an idea that the people who truly stopped and thought about this one who would be designated the shepherd of Israel would look back to that 23rd psalm and say, that is indeed what he is going to do. You remember that psalm? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. The shepherd of Israel would provide rest, refreshment, protection, guidance, and the people would look to this shepherd and say, that is what we are looking for. And when the Magi came into the house where the little family was, they found the shepherd of Israel. The Magi found the Son of God, and perhaps this is the most exciting aspect of what they found. They found the King of Israel. They found the shepherd of Israel. One may kneel before a league or bow before a monarch, but one does not worship a king. These came into the house and not only bowed down, knelt down, but they worshiped him. The text is very specific to say they worshiped him before they